Hello good people, this is Neil again. Nice to see you. This morning we're doing the fourth video, and let's get going. I'm going to give you the exact title. It's called Ever Wonder Why Life Doesn't Seem Meaningful Enough? When we get into meaningful lives, as far as I'm concerned, it is a foundational question to be explored and to be understood. Okay? Let's start with why that question is asked. If we look at the people that we most admire on the planet, from current rock stars to authors to anyone who we would all look at and go, they've got the life, it's amazing how many of them, when interviewed, are not happy with their lives, and how many of them also do stuff that cause them to die prematurely. So there's something about our looking at someone and admiring them which somehow isn't fitting with their internal version of them having enough meaning in their life to have a very focused and amazing life, a life where they're literally going, I love what I'm doing and what I'm doing is important. So once again, ever wonder why life doesn't seem meaningful enough? I'm going to start with chapter in Me, Myself, Mindfulness once again, and I'm going to read a little more from this than I usually do because it's such a tricky topic. He's at it again. My brother Nicholas really does have the strangest ideas. The problem, once again, is that they make so much sense to me. The precocious boy read Dad's college-level developmental psychology textbook over school break, and now he thinks we have it only half right, and we are omitting a really important part that is needed for our healthy development. So here's how it goes, or rather, here's how I understand his ramblings and insights. We simultaneously live on two levels, he screams. This is what's normal for our species. We need to know this if we are ever to understand what's going on and our place in it. According to the textbook, what seems important is learning how to accomplish tasks as separate individuals. We each need to learn how to walk, feed ourselves, ride a bike or skateboard, succeed in school, hold a job. These are all very important skills to be sure. However, they all focus on development on an individual level, also known as the personal dimension of growth. According to Nicholas, there also exists a transpersonal dimension of growth. This can easily be observed in children and adults having a contemplative philosophical moment when they ask or ponder questions like, why are we here? Where do we go when we die? Is there a greater purpose to my life and to our lives in general? Are we evolving in a specific direction? Am I living my life with this direction in mind? These questions all concern our development as members of the human species, where our sense of self expands beyond our personal dimension to include our connection to all of humanity. Nicholas says that we need to be helping children develop on both a personal and on a transpersonal level. We simultaneously live as specific individuals and as collected members of humanity. He says that all of our saints, prophets, and spiritual leaders like Jesus, Buddha, Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, he keeps on naming people, all acknowledge this. He talks about many indigenous cultures that focus equally on the transpersonal dimension and on the personal dimension. He says that if we are ever going to raise healthy children, that both dimensions of our existence need to be nourished and evenly balanced. He talks about an ocean, and he says, let's look at an individual wave. That's an individual wave, but it's also part of an ocean. An individual wave may have its own sense of self, its own identity. We can see it as one wave, but it doesn't exist and can't exist apart from an ocean. So it's one smaller piece as part of a larger piece. Let's look at one tree in a forest. That one tree exists by itself, but it exists as a member of a forest. Let's look at one star. One star exists by itself, but it's not there by itself. It's part of a whole group of hundreds and thousands of stars, all of which coexist together. According to Nicholas, as humans, we simultaneously exist as individuals. I am myself an individual human being, and we simultaneously exist as members of humanity. And in order to have meaning and fulfillment in our life, we can't just be fulfilling needs on the individual level. We need to acknowledge both of our dimensions, that we are individuals and we are members of a species, and we need to live lives that are supporting and that have goals and direction for both our individualness and our collectiveness at the same time. Do you think that you live in two dimensions? I think the culture we live in supports our individualization to a large extent these days, that we're trying to take care of ourselves. We may bring in family members or our towns, but we hardly ever get to the place where Jesus and Muhammad and Mother Teresa and all the others got to, which is, let's not have smaller groupings, but let's look at our relationship to humanity and what can we do to help foster and help and heal, not just us as individuals, but as members of a species. And when I look at healing in this culture, if someone has a broken arm or a migraine or something that's working in their kidney, we tend to go to a doctor and go, what can you do for me? There's not a lot these days that has happened in indigenous cultures where we're going to dance all night, where we're going to chant all night. And the idea is, can we get an energy and a vibration that's going to heal not just one member in that group, but every member in that group? That was the norm for the majority of our being alive as the species, and somehow we've lost that collective way of healing, that largely collective way of looking at ourselves as a group, a species of individuals. Okay? I'll come back to this book in a second, but I do want to, as I do in each of these, is talk about another book. My Stroke of Insight. My Stroke of Insight is a brains scientist journey. Her name is Jill Bolte Taylor, and she's a PhD. And I'm going to read just the very beginning of the inside of her book as well, because her experiences talks about the fact that our distinctly human part of our brain has two hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And again, the culture we live in is clearly skewed to our living in a left hemisphere. And in this, we'll talk about how we live in our left hemisphere. But when she had a stroke and the left hemisphere was totally destroyed, she was living in her right hemisphere more than usual. And the dialogue going on inside of her mind between her two hemispheres, I think, is absolutely amazing. So here goes just a little bit. On the morning of December 10th, 1996, Jill Bolte Taylor, a 37-year-old Harvard-trained brain scientist, experienced a massive stroke when a blood vessel exploded in the left side of her brain. A neuroanatomist by profession, she observed her mind completely deteriorate to the point that she could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of her life, all within the space of 4 brief hours. As the damaged left side of her brain, the rational, grounded, detail and time-oriented side, swung in and out of function. Taylor alternated between two distinct and opposite realities, the euphoric nirvana of intuitive and kinesthetic right brain, in which she felt a sense of complete well-being and peace, and the logical, sequential left brain, which recognized Jill was having a stroke and enabled her to seek help before she was completely lost. So she was seeing literally her right hemisphere going, it's all peaceful, you're all connected, you're not one individual, you're all energy connected with everyone, and she was totally peaceful. And then her left hemisphere, who said, you're Jill, come back, we've got to save you. And in the book and in the 18-minute TED Talk called My Stroke of Insight, she talks about both of those, that experience both ways, and it is amazing. Today, Taylor is convinced that the stroke was the best thing that could have happened to her. It has taught her that the feeling of nirvana, of peace, is never more than a mere thought away. By stepping to the right of our left brains, which is a really short distance to go, we can uncover the feelings of well-being and peace that are so often sidelined by our brain chatter. A fascinating journey into the mechanics of the human mind. My stroke of insight is both a valuable recovery guide for anyone touched by a brain injury and an emotionally stirring testimony that deep internal peace truly is accessible to anyone at one time. What she says in the book and the video is peace is available to her in her right hemisphere because when she's living there, she no longer experiences herself as one individual, as one star, as one tree, as one wave. What she does is experiences herself as constellations of stars, as forests of trees, of oceans of waves. Imagine that. For me, it's a hard thing to even imagine because I go there so seldomly, which is I'm not defending myself, I'm not trying to cope, and whenever you're trying to defend yourself, if you're like me, I almost take my sense of self, my sense of who I am, and make it as small as possible and have all my defenses around it. Well, she was able to go to the extreme where there was no defenses needed whatsoever, and her sense of self was able to expand so far that she had a sense of, I'm connected to everyone, therefore I needn't be worried about anything because I am that large. I think we all have moments every day where our sense of self modulates back and forth. If you are just looking at a sunset and it's a peaceful moment, you're not living in the same space where you're defending yourself as someone is screaming at you or an animal is trying to attack you, where you're so small and so rigid and so focused, you begin to enlarge in where you're living. If you're having a great conversation with a new friend who you like a lot, you're not worried about defending yourself the way you are trying to interact with this other person. If you and a group of people are singing together or chanting together or dancing together or meditating together or doing yoga together, you may not get stuck in your sense of who you are. And I think all of those experiences are best when you kind of go, forget about who I am, let me enjoy all these people doing this together and get into that vibe and that energy where my sense of who I am is intermingled with everybody else's. And I think normally we do that every day, and we crave having moments where we're not having a rigid and small sense of self, but it begins to expand. Much like breath, I think we do that again and again and again. And in the extreme, we get to a place where we have lost our sense of self and feel connected to everyone. That's going back. I want to do two other things quickly. Going back to the three brains, which is the first one of these we did, our distinctly human part of the brain, we talked about it, but that's our left hemisphere. Now we know we also have a right hemisphere, which is almost always observing and being compassionate to who we are, but when we can get there, our lived experiences are really drastically different, drastically more compassionate, and in a place that I think most of us would love to live in more often, and probably where our culture needs to live in more often as well. Going back to the four functions, how do we get to this place? Through intuition. If we're thinking, if we're analyzing, we're in our right hemisphere. Our left hemisphere is intuition. And intuition, let me just say one more thing about that. If I'm using my intuition, I'm opening up my eyes as wide as possible. I'm not consciously looking at something. I'm seeing what draws my attention from the outside world. So instead of going, I'm looking at this, I'm looking at this, I'm just going, open up. And something externally is pulling my focus there. So again, you're seeing the connection between these different videos so far, because they all, when in balance, they all work together, and the amount of health that a human being and a culture can have when these are in balance is probably places that most of us don't live often enough, but dream of living. So if you don't have enough meaning in your life, the question is, in addition to working on your personal dimension of growth, including it to have your transpersonal dimension of growth as well, and keeping them in balance. This is probably a tricky one. However, I think is a really important one. Enjoy the day. Be well.